Hello everyone, in the video of today we are going to discuss properties of the absolute values. So let's get started. The first property of the absolute value, let's say that you have the absolute value of x. You don't know that the value of x is a positive number or a negative number. However, whatever is the number, the absolute value of it will be greater than or equal to 0. Even if x was a negative number, the absolute value of it will be a positive number, as we discussed previously. So let's say that you have the absolute value of negative 5. It will be equal to 5. And 5 is greater than 0. So keep in your mind the absolute value of any variable will result to a number that is greater than or equal to 0. The second property of the absolute value, let's say that you have the absolute value of negative x. It will always equal to the absolute value of x, even if the variable was multiplied by negative or it was a positive variable, the answer of it will be a positive number. As long as the negative sign or the positive sign and the variable are inside the absolute value notation, which can be represented by the two vertical lines, the result of them will be a positive number. So let's have an example. Let's say that you have the absolute value of negative 4, which equal to 4. And it will be equal to the absolute value of 4, which also equal to 4. And this will be the second property of the absolute value. The third property of the absolute value, let's say that you have the absolute value of variable x multiplied by variable y. Here you can distribute the absolute value between these two variables. So it will be equal to the absolute value of x multiplied by the absolute value of y. This property can happen if the operation between the variables is multiplication. So let's have an example. Let's say that you have the absolute value of 2 multiplied by 3. Now I can distribute the absolute value. I can say it is equal to the absolute value of 2 multiplied by the absolute value of 3. And we can say that, or we can see that the answer of this will be 6. Now let's move to the fourth and the last property of the absolute value. If you have the absolute value of x divided by y. So we know that the division is the opposite operation of multiplication. So we can also distribute the absolute value if we have a division. So it will be equal to the absolute value of x divided by the absolute value of y. There is no problem as long as y should not be equal to 0, because it is in the denominator. So if you have an example like this, you have the absolute value of 4 divided by 2. You can distribute the absolute value among these numbers. So it will be the absolute value of 4 divided by the absolute value of 2, which is equal to number 2. Now keep in your mind that you can distribute the absolute value if you only have the operation between the variables or numbers of multiplication or division. So you can't do this for the other operations. So if you have the absolute value of x plus or minus y, you cannot distribute the absolute value. It will not be equal to the absolute value of x plus or minus the absolute value of y. You will have different values. They are not going to be equal. So let's have an example. Example 9. Place the appropriate symbol less than or greater than or equal between the pair of real numbers. Part A, you have the absolute value of negative 4. Is it greater than or less than or equal to the absolute value of 3? So to compare between these two numbers, you must extract the absolute value of them. So let's get started with the first one. The absolute value of negative 4 is equal to 4. And we know that the absolute value of 3 is equal to 3. So we have 4 and 3. We can see that 4 is greater than 3. So the absolute value of negative 4 is greater than the absolute value of 3. Now let's move to part B. You have the absolute value of negative 10 comparing to the absolute value of 10. Let's solve it here. The absolute value of negative 10 is equal to 10. And the absolute value of 10 is equal to 10. So these are the two numbers, 10 and 10. And we can see that they are equal to each other. So the absolute value of negative 10 is equal to the absolute value of positive 10. Now let's move to part C. We have negative, the absolute value of negative 7, comparing to the absolute value of 7. So let's start with negative, the absolute value of negative 7. And we know that it will be equal to negative 7 because the absolute value of negative 7 is 7. And there is a negative outside the absolute value. So it will be equal to negative 7. And the absolute value of 7 is equal to 7. So we have negative 7 and 7. And we can clearly see that negative 7 is less than the 7. So negative, the absolute value of negative 7 is less than the absolute value of 7. Now, let's talk about distance between 2 points on the real number line. We already mentioned that the absolute value will give you the distance from the origin to the real number. But what about if you have 2 different real numbers and you need to calculate the distance between them? You will have this formula, the distance between x and y, which can represent the real numbers, will be equal to the absolute value of x minus y, or the absolute value of y minus x. So this formula will give you the distance between these two real numbers. Let's say that x is equal to negative 10 and y is equal to 7. So we want to calculate the distance between these two numbers. We will have the absolute value of x, which is negative 10, minus y, which is 7. The minus here is from the original rule. So this will be equal to the absolute value of negative 17, which is equal to 17. Now, let's assume that x is equal to 10 and y is equal to negative 7. So once again, to calculate the distance between these two numbers, you must put them inside the absolute value. Now x is equal to 10 minus, which is from the original rule, and y will be negative 7. And we can say that negative multiplied by negative is equal to positive number. So it will be 10 plus 7, which equal to the absolute value of 17, and it will equal to 17. Now let's move to the other scenario. Let's say that x is equal to 10 and y is equal to 7. Let's calculate the distance between these two numbers. We will have the absolute value of x, which is 10, minus the absolute value of y, which is 7. So we can see that it will be equal to the absolute value of 3. So it will be equal to 3. And the last scenario that we have, if x is equal to negative 10 and y is equal to negative 7. So we are going to calculate the absolute value between negative 10, which is x, minus y, which is negative 7. So we will have positive 7 with negative 10. So it will be equal to the absolute value of negative 3, and this will be equal to 3. Let us take an example. Example 10. Find the distance between negative 25 and 13. So to find the distance between any two numbers, we are going to apply the rule, which is the absolute value of x minus y. So x is negative 25 and y is 13. We are going to substitute them. The absolute value of x, which is negative 25, minus from the rule, and y will be 13. It will be equal to negative 38, which is equal to 38. And this is the distance between these two numbers. It will be 38 units. Now, I want you to take your notebook and have this practice 0.5. Place the appropriate symbol less than or greater than or equal between the pair of real numbers. You have the absolute value of negative 3 and comparing to the absolute value of 4. And you also have negative the absolute value of negative 4 comparing to negative the absolute value of 4. And the last pair of numbers, you have the absolute value of negative 3 comparing to negative the absolute value of negative 3. Then you have this question, find the distance between the first pair. You have 35 and negative 23. Then you have negative 35 and negative 23. And the last pair of numbers, you have 35 and 23. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching.